The forest had always been Jake's sanctuary, a place where he could escape the noise and chaos of city life, where he could lose himself in the quiet rhythms of nature. But as he stepped out of his truck and into the dense thicket, he noticed something different. The air was still, unnaturally so. Not the tranquil stillness that comes with a gentle breeze or the rustle of leaves, but an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow every sound. "It's just the calm before the storm," Jake told himself, tightening the straps on his backpack. He had chosen this forest for its remoteness, its promise of untouched wilderness. But now, standing at the edge of the trail, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was a foolish thought. There wasn't another soul for miles. But the unease lingered, a persistent itch at the back of his mind. As he made his way deeper into the woods, the path beneath his boots began to narrow, the trees crowding closer together as if conspiring to block out the sky. The further he went, the more the world seemed to close in on him. The usual chorus of birds and insects was conspicuously absent, replaced by a low, thrumming hum that vibrated through the ground and into his bones. It was faint, barely audible, but once he noticed it, it was impossible to ignore. Jake paused, adjusting the focus on his camera, and scanned the dense foliage around him. The lens captured nothing but the emerald blur of leaves and the dark, gnarled trunks of ancient trees. He snapped a few shots anyway, more out of habit than interest. There was something unsettling about the emptiness of it all, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The day stretched on, the oppressive silence pressing down on Jake as he ventured further from the safety of his truck. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the forest bearing down on him. The hum persisted, growing louder as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows that twisted and warped the landscape into something unfamiliar and vaguely threatening. By the time he decided to set up camp, the unease had grown into a gnawing anxiety that he couldn't shake. The clearing he chose felt wrong, too exposed, too quiet. But he was tired, and the thought of retracing his steps in the dark was less appealing than a night spent under the stars. He pitched his tent quickly, his movements jerky and impatient, his ears straining to catch any sound that might break the silence. As the night crept in, the hum deepened, resonating in the pit of his stomach. Jake sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to writhe just beyond the circle of light. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, but it did little to dispel the tension coiling in his chest. Then, just as he was beginning to relax, he heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, carried on the wind. It was barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakable. Jake's blood ran cold as he strained to listen, every muscle tensing as he waited for the voice to return. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the crackle of the fire and the incessant hum that had now settled into his bones. And then, the voice came again, clearer this time, but still warped and distant, like a radio transmission barely coming through. "Help me!" Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he stood up, the firelight casting flickering shadows on his face. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement, but the forest remained still, oppressive in its silence. "Is someone out there?" he called, his voice sounding small and uncertain in the vast emptiness. The only answer was the echo of his own voice, distorted and faint as it bounced off the trees. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. "It's just the wind," he told himself, though he knew it wasn't true. There was something out there, something that didn't belong. The hum had grown louder now, almost a physical presence pressing in on him from all sides. It was as if the forest itself was vibrating, alive with a low, resonant frequency that set his teeth on edge. Jake fumbled with his camera, his hands shaking as he adjusted the settings and peered through the lens. The screen was filled with the ghostly outlines of trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He scanned the clearing, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of the source of the voice. Nothing. He was about to lower the camera when a flicker of motion caught his eye. Something tall and thin moved through the trees, just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the dim light. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he zoomed in, trying to get a better look. But whatever it was gone, swallowed by the darkness before he could focus. He blinked, trying to convince himself that it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering flames. But the unease gnawing at his gut told him otherwise. "Hello?" he called again, his voice trembling. The forest remained silent, the only response the low hum that now seemed to pulse in time with his racing heart. Jake stood frozen, staring into the darkness, his camera still trained on the spot where he had seen the movement. His mind raced, every instinct screaming at him to pack up and leave, to get as far away from this place as possible. But his feet remained rooted to the ground, as if the forest itself was holding him in place. Minutes passed in agonizing silence, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then, just as Jake was beginning to think he had imagined it all, the voice came again, closer this time, more distinct. "Help me, please." Jake's blood turned to ice as he swung the camera back around, the lens searching frantically for the source of the voice. And then he saw it, standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light. A figure, impossibly tall and thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its head was misshapen, twisted, with what looked like speakers? Or were they sirens? The details were impossible to make out, but the shape was wrong. All wrong. Jake's breath caught in his throat as the figure began to move, its limbs unfolding with unnatural grace as it stepped into the clearing. The hum grew louder, the vibrations intensifying until they seemed to fill his entire body, threatening to tear him apart from the inside out. He wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there and watch as the creature approached. But he was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a terror so profound it seemed to seep into his very soul. The figure drew closer, the distorted voice still echoing from somewhere deep within it. But now it wasn't just one voice. There were many, all speaking at once, overlapping and blending together in a cacophony of sound. It was both alien and horrifyingly familiar. "Help me get out. Lost. Can't run." Jake's mind reeled as the voices grew louder, more insistent. They were all around him now, coming from every direction, whispering in his ears, clawing at the edges of his sanity. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voices stopped. The hum died away, leaving only the crackling of the fire and the sound of Jake's ragged breathing. The figure was gone. Vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The clearing was empty, the forest once again shrouded in an oppressive silence. But the sense of unease remained, heavier than ever, pressing down on Jake's chest like a weight. He stood there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, waiting for the creature to return. But it didn't. The forest remained still, the shadows deep and impenetrable. Finally, Jake forced himself to move, his legs trembling as he stumbled back to the fire. He collapsed onto the ground, his heart still pounding in his chest, his mind racing with questions he couldn't begin to answer. What had he seen? Was it real? Or was his mind playing tricks on him, the isolation and silence warping his perception of reality? But deep down, he knew the truth. The figure, the voices, the hum. They were real as the forest itself. And whatever it was still out there, watching him, waiting. Jake pulled his sleeping bag closer, his hands trembling as he zipped it up to his chin. He lay there, staring up at the stars, his mind spinning with fear and confusion. The forest had taken on a new, sinister life, and the shadows seemed to twist and writhe with a malevolent energy. Sleep was impossible. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch sent his heart racing, his mind conjuring images of the figure looming over him, its twisted form blotting out the sky. As the hours dragged on, Jake's exhaustion finally caught up with him. His eyelids grew heavy, his thoughts blurring into a haze of fear and uncertainty. But even as he drifted off, the hum persisted, echoing in the back of his mind, a constant, maddening presence that refused to let him go. And just before sleep claimed him, he heard it again, a faint, distorted voice, barely more than a whisper, drifting through the trees. "Help me." But this time, the voice wasn't coming from the forest. it was coming from inside his own head. Jake woke to the disorienting sensation of being submerged in a pool of thick, syrupy silence. The fire had long since died out, leaving the clearing cloaked in darkness. He lay still, every muscle tense, listening for any sign of movement. But the only sound was the soft thud of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears. The memory of the previous night flooded back, and with it, a sharp jolt of fear. He sat up quickly, scanning the surrounding woods for any sign of the creature. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees, casting long, pale shadows on the forest floor. Everything was still, unnervingly so, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Jake forced himself to move, his muscles stiff and aching from a night spent in fear. He packed up his gear with trembling hands, his mind racing with the events of the night before. He couldn't shake the image of the figure. Tall, twisted, and wrong. Its siren-like head emitting that unearthly hum. And those voices, they still echoed faintly in his mind. A chorus of despair that seemed to cling to him, refusing to let go. I need to get out of here, he thought, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. But as he turned to retrace his steps back to the truck, a realization hit him with the force of a sledgehammer. The trail was gone. Jake stood frozen, staring at the spot where the path should have been. The trees seemed to have shifted in the night, their trunks crowding closer together, their branches entwined in a dense, impenetrable mass. There was no sign of the trail he had followed in, no clear direction to guide him back to safety. Panic welled up in his chest, threatening to choke him. He spun in a slow circle, searching desperately for any landmark, any sign that could lead him out. But the forest had transformed into a maze of shadows and indistinguishable shapes, every tree looking exactly like the last. Stay calm, he told himself, taking a deep breath. You're just disoriented. The trail has to be here somewhere. But no matter which direction he looked, the path remained stubbornly hidden. The oppressive silence bore down on him, amplifying the frantic pounding of his heart in his chest. Jake's mind raced, struggling to make sense of the situation. This doesn't make any sense. He had walked this path just the day before, and now it was as if the forest had swallowed it whole. He checked his compass, but the needle spun uselessly, as if the forest had scrambled even the basic laws of nature. With no other options, Jake chose a direction and began to walk, forcing himself to stay calm. The trees loomed over him like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches forming a twisted canopy that blocked out the sky. The further he went, the more the forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pressing in from all sides, suffocating in their proximity. He walked for what felt like hours, but the landscape never changed. The same twisted trunks, the same shadowed undergrowth, the same oppressive silence. It was as if he was walking in circles, trapped in a nightmarish loop with no way out. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, the forest thinned out, revealing a clearing up ahead. Relief washed over him as he hurried forward, but as he broke through the tree line, his relief quickly turned to dread. Before him stood the remnants of a small abandoned town. The buildings were crumbling, their walls streaked with moss and decay. Windows were shattered, their glass shards glinting like jagged teeth in the pale light. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rot, a cloying, suffocating scent that clung to his nostrils. Jake hesitated at the edge of the clearing, an overwhelming sense of wrongness settling over him. This town wasn't on any map. He was sure of that. It was as if it had been forgotten by the world, left to rot in the heart of the forest, hidden from view. He took a tentative step forward, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. The buildings seemed to loom over him, their dark, empty windows watching his every move. The hum was back, faint but insistent, vibrating through the ground and into his bones. With no other option, Jake made his way into the town, his eyes scanning every shadow, every darkened doorway. The streets were deserted, choked with weeds and debris, as if the town had been abandoned in a hurry. He passed by what must have once been a general store, its sign hanging crookedly on rusted chains. Inside, the shelves were bare, the floor covered in a thick layer of dust and grime. He moved on, passing more crumbling buildings. A schoolhouse, its roof caved in. A small church with a broken bell tower. A row of houses, their doors hanging off their hinges. The further he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, the hum growing louder, more insistent. As Jake reached the center of town, he stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in his throat. In the middle of the square stood an old, rusted radio tower, its antennae pointing skyward like skeletal fingers. The tower was the source of the hum, its rusted frame vibrating with the sound, sending waves of unease through Jake's body. But that wasn't what made his blood run cold. At the base of the tower, scattered in the dirt, were old newspaper clippings and faded photographs. Jake knelt down, picking up one of the papers, his hands shaking. The headline was barely legible. The ink faded and smeared, but the words sent a chill down his spine. Residents report strange noises. Disappearance of local man remains unsolved. Jake's eyes scanned the article, the words blurring together in his growing panic. The town had been plagued by strange occurrences. People hearing voices, seeing figures in the woods, and then vanishing without a trace. The last entry was dated over 50 years ago, and there was no follow-up, no resolution. It was as if the town had simply ceased to exist after that. He dropped the paper and picked up a photograph, his heart pounding in his chest. The image was old, faded, but the figure in it was unmistakable. Tall, thin, with elongated limbs and a head that was nothing but a grotesque siren. The same figure he had seen the night before. Jake's stomach churned with fear as he let the photo slip from his fingers. The hum from the tower grew louder, vibrating through the ground, through his bones, through his mind. It was as if the tower was alive, feeding off the fear that now gripped his entire being. He stumbled back, his gaze locked on the tower, the realization dawning on him like a slow, creeping horror. The tower wasn't just a structure, it was a beacon, drawing something to it, something that thrived on fear and despair. Jake turned to run, but his feet seemed rooted to the ground, the hum holding him in place. His vision blurred, the edges of his world fraying as the sound intensified, burrowing into his mind, overwhelming every thought, every sense. And then, the voices returned. They were louder now, more distinct, each one a twisted echo of the last, overlapping and blending together in a cacophony of sound that clawed at the edges of his sanity. Can't escape. Lost. Don't leave me here. Please. Jake clamped his hands over his ears, trying to block out the voices, but it was no use. They were inside his head, gnawing at his mind, tearing at his thoughts. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, the world around him dissolving into a haze of noise and terror. The ground beneath him seemed to shift, the buildings warping and twisting in his vision. The shadows grew longer, darker, taking on forms that writhed and pulsed with a life of their own. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of rot, of something ancient and malevolent. And through it all, the figure approached. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he saw it again, tall, impossibly thin, its limbs unfolding with a slow, deliberate grace. Its head was a grotesque mockery of a human face, twisted into something unrecognizable. Something wrong. The sirens atop its head blared to life, emitting a deafening, distorted wail that reverberated through the air, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. The sound was unbearable, a shriek of pure, unadulterated terror that pierced through Jake's mind, obliterating every thought, every shred of reason. He stumbled back, his hands still clamped over his ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside him, tearing him apart from the inside out. The figure loomed closer, its sirens blaring, the distorted voices now a part of the sound, screaming and crying and begging for release. Jake's vision blurred, the world spinning around him as the sound reached a fever pitch, drowning out everything else. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. Jake collapsed to the ground, his ears ringing, his mind reeling from the sudden silence. The figure was gone, the square empty, the town silent once more. But the damage had been done. The voices still echoed in his mind, a constant, maddening presence that refused to let go. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, his body trembling, his mind shattered. The town loomed over him, a silent, decaying monument to whatever horror had claimed it, and now, it seemed, had claimed him as well. Finally, Jake forced himself to move, every muscle protesting as he pushed himself up from the ground. He had to get out, had to find a way out of this nightmare. But as he stumbled to his feet, he realized with a sinking dread that there was no way out. The forest had closed in around the town, the trees pressing in from all sides, their twisted branches forming a dense, impenetrable wall. The path was gone, swallowed by the forest, leaving him trapped in this forgotten place with no escape. The hum returned, faint but insistent, vibrating through the ground, through his bones, through his mind. The town seemed to pulse with it, the buildings warping and twisting in his vision, the shadows writhing with a life of their own. Jake's breath came in ragged gasps as he turned in circles, searching for any way out, any path that would lead him back to safety. But the town was a prison, its walls closing in around him, the hum growing louder, more insistent, more maddening. And then, in the distance, he saw it. Just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dim light, the figure, impossibly tall and thin, its sirens blaring once more, its limbs unfolding with that same unnatural grace. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as the figure began to move, its distorted voice echoing through the town, filling his mind with its twisted, unrelenting presence. There was no escape. There was no way out. The town was a tomb, and Jake knew, with a cold, creeping certainty, that he would never leave. Jake's breaths came in shallow, painful gasps, each one catching in his throat as he staggered through the narrow, crumbling streets of the abandoned town. The walls of the old buildings seemed to close in on him, their darkened windows watching with a silent, malevolent presence. The hum that had been a constant companion was now a deafening roar, reverberating through his skull, shaking the very core of his sanity. He couldn't remember how long he had been running. Minutes, hours, days? Time had lost all meaning in this nightmare, each moment bleeding into the next in a haze of fear and disorientation. His thoughts were fractured, scattered like leaves in a storm. But one thing was clear. He had to find a way out. But even as that desperate thought took hold, he knew, deep down, that there was no escape. The figure, the creature, had made sure of that. It was always there, just at the edge of his vision, its distorted, towering form, a constant, looming threat. Jake stumbled to a stop in front of the radio tower, its rusted frame vibrating with the same malevolent energy that thrummed through his veins. The ground beneath him seemed to pulse in time with the tower, the air thick with the smell of burnt metal and decay. The hum had become a living thing, a presence that burrowed deep into his mind, gnawing at the last threads of his sanity. He looked up at the tower, his vision swimming with exhaustion and terror. The sky above was a sickly bruised color, the sun barely a smudge of light through the thick, oppressive clouds. The world had shrunk to this one point, this one cursed place, where reality seemed to fray at the edges, unraveling into something twisted and wrong. This is where it ends, Jake thought, the realization sinking into him with a cold finality. There was no way out. The town had claimed him, just as it had claimed the others, and there was nothing left to do but face whatever horror awaited him. With a shuddering breath, Jake began to climb the tower, his hands slipping on the rusted rungs. The metal was cold and slick with moisture, each step a monumental effort as his body screamed in protest. The hum grew louder with each foot of elevation, the vibrations intensifying until they rattled his teeth and blurred his vision. But he kept climbing, driven by some primal instinct that told him this was the only way, the only chance he had to end the nightmare. He couldn't run anymore, couldn't hide. He had to confront it, to face the terror head-on, no matter the cost. As he neared the top of the tower, the hum reached a fever pitch, a throbbing, pulsating wave of sound that threatened to tear him apart. His vision blurred, the world around him dissolving into a swirling mass of color and light, the edges of reality crumbling away. Jake hauled himself onto the small platform at the top of the tower, the metal creaking ominously beneath his weight. The town below was a shadowy blur, the buildings warping and shifting as if seen through a heat haze. The forest that surrounded the town was a dark, seething mass, the trees twisting and writhing like living things. And there, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the figure. Siren Head. It was taller than Jake remembered, its limbs impossibly long and thin, its grotesque head a nightmarish fusion of bone and metal. The sirens atop its head blared to life, emitting a distorted, ear-splitting wail that shook the very air, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Jake clamped his hands over his ears, but it was no use. The sound was inside him, tearing through his mind, shredding every coherent thought. The voices returned, screaming in a cacophony of despair and fear, each one overlapping the other, until they were a single, unending wail of agony. "Help me, please. Lost, so cold, can't run." The voices clawed at the edges of Jake's sanity, dragging him down into a pit of fear and confusion. He could feel his grip on reality slipping, the world around him dissolving into a haze of noise and terror. Siren Head began to move, its limbs unfolding with a slow, deliberate grace as it stepped into the clearing. The ground shook with each step, the air vibrating with the force of its presence. Jake could feel it in his bones, a primal terror that seeped into every fiber of his being. With the last shreds of his sanity slipping away, Jake fumbled for his camera. His mind was a maelstrom of fear, but some desperate part of him clung to the idea that if he could capture this, if he could document it, maybe it would make some sense. Maybe it would be real. His hands shook violently as he brought the camera to his eye, trying to focus on the towering figure as it approached. The sirens on its head blared with a low, droning hum now, a sound that seemed to resonate deep within Jake's skull, reverberating through his very soul. He hit the record button. The camera whirred to life, the lens capturing the grotesque form of Siren Head as it moved closer, its limbs stretching out in unnatural angles. The voices, so many voices, poured from the sirens, a jumbled mess of screams, pleas, and whispers. "You're lost. No escape. You'll never leave. You're ours now." The camera recorded it all. The distorted, nightmarish figure, the twisted landscape, the sounds that shouldn't exist. Jake's breath came in shallow gasps, his vision tunneling as the creature loomed over him, filling the frame with its impossibly tall, emaciated form. And then, in one final moment of clarity, Jake turned the camera on himself. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror, a man on the brink of madness. The hum was all he could hear now, a constant low vibration that seemed to shake the very ground beneath him. He looked into the lens, his voice barely more than a whisper. "If you find this, stay away. It's not just a place. It's alive. And it's hungry." The camera shook as he fell to his knees, the image blurring before coming back into focus. Siren Head towered over him now, its sirens emitting that low, eerie hum that Jake knew would be the last sound he ever heard. The camera captured it all, the long skeletal fingers reaching down, the sirens blaring one last distorted wail. And then, just as the creature's shadow engulfed him, the camera cut out. Days later, Jake's camera was found in the middle of the forest, its casing battered and smeared with dirt. The authorities, who had been searching for Jake since his disappearance, retrieved the camera and played back the footage. It was corrupted, glitching, the audio warping and distorting, but the images were clear enough. The final shot was of Siren Head standing over Jake, its sirens emitting that low, eerie hum. The creature was a blur of motion, its limbs unfolding in impossible ways, its presence a violation of everything sane and natural. The camera cut out just as the creature reached down toward the lens. Those who watched the footage described an overwhelming sense of dread, a feeling that something was watching them, even after the recording ended. And, disturbingly, many reported hearing a faint hum, barely audible at first, that grew louder with each passing night. A hum that echoed in their minds, just like it did for Jake. They say that once you've heard the hum, it never leaves you. It follows you. A constant reminder that there are things in the world that can't be explained. Things that lurk just beyond the edge of reality, waiting for the right moment to reach out and claim you. And if you listen closely, in the dead of night, you might hear it too.